The city sleeps beneath a veil of fog and forgotten prayers. They say the vampire king walks when the moon hides its face, not to hunt, but to witness, to remember what it means to feel rage so pure it could burn the world to ash. Tonight, he would remember. Tonight, a child's whispered confession would awaken something older than hunger, darker than death itself. Some monsters are born, others are made, but the worst ones, they walk in daylight, wearing human faces, breaking what they promise to protect. And when the king finds them, mercy becomes a language no one speaks. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and distant smoke through the narrow streets of Providence, Rhode Island. It was a kind of night when sensible people locked their doors early, when the darkness felt heavy, textured, almost sentient. The street lamps flickered in rhythmic intervals, casting pools of jaundiced light across cracked sidewalks that had seen better decades. Victor Ashford, though few remember that name anymore, moved through the shadows like water flowing downhill, inevitable, silent, ancient. The Vampire King, they called him in whispers, not because he commanded armies of the undead or held court in some Gothic fortress. Those were fairy tales. No, Victor had earned his title through 3 centuries of existence, through the weight of power that radiated from him like heat from forged iron, through eyes that had watched empires crumble and reform like sand castles before the tide. He wore a long black coat that whispered against his legs as he walked, hands buried in deep pockets, silver hair pulled back from a face that could have been 30 or 300 depending on the light. His features were sharp, aristocratic, carved from marble and moonlight, but it was his eyes that truly marked him as other, gray as winter storms, depthless as ocean trenches, holding within him the accumulated sorrow and rage of lifetimes. Tonight he walked because stillness had become unbearable. The hunger was always there, a low simmer in his veins, but he had learned centuries ago to master it. What he couldn't master was a restlessness, the gnawing sense that immortality was just another word for being forced to watch the same tragedies play out in infinite variation, powerless to change the fundamental cruelty woven into human nature. The fog thickened as he moved deeper into the old industrial district, where abandoned factories loomed like the rib cages of dead giants. This was a forgotten place, where the city's promise had failed, where poverty and desperation pooled in the spaces between broken streetlights. Most avoided these streets after dark. Victor walked them precisely because they held truth, the kind of raw, unvarnished reality that the comfortable parts of the city pretended didn't exist. He was passing an alley mouth, a vertical slice of absolute darkness between 2 brick walls spray-painted with faded gang tags, when he heard it. A sound so small it might have been wind, a sob, barely audible, threaded with a particular quality of hopelessness that only children possess when they've learned the world is not safe and no one is coming to save them. Victor stopped, turned. His senses, far sharper than any human's, mapped the darkness in an instant. One small heartbeat, rapid and frightened. No threats. Just a child, alone, crying in the dark. Something in his chest, the space where a heart once beat warm and human, contracted painfully. He moved into the alley with preternatural silence, and there, huddled against the cold brick, knees drawn to chest, face buried in folded arms, was a boy, perhaps 9 years old, perhaps 10, thin, wearing a jacket too light for the October chill, sneakers with holes in the canvas, jeans grass-stained and torn at one knee. The boy didn't hear him approach. Victor stood there for a long moment, studying the small, shaking form, and felt the familiar war within himself. The part that remembered being human wanted to help. The part that had learned harsh lessons about interference wanted to walk away. Nothing good came from a vampire involving himself in mortal affairs. Nothing but pain and complication, and the eventual, inevitable moment when a human realized what he truly was, and looked at him with fear instead of trust. But the child was crying. Alone, in the dark. Victor cleared his throat softly. It's not safe here. The boy's head snapped up, eyes wide and red-rimmed, face streaked with tears that caught the distant streetlight like silver threads. For a moment they simply stared at each other, immortal predator and frightened child. And Victor saw the calculation happening behind those young eyes. The boy was assessing threat level, deciding whether to run. I'm not going to hurt you. Victor said quietly, keeping his distance, hands visible. His voice was low, cultured, with a faint trace of an accent that belonged to no living country. But you shouldn't be out here alone. It's late, it's cold, and this neighborhood. I know, the boy interrupted, voice cracking. I know it's dangerous. I couldn't stay there anymore. I couldn't watch. His voice broke completely then, collapsing into fresh sobs. His whole small body shook with the force of them, and Victor felt that strange pain in his chest intensify. He had seen countless humans suffer over the centuries, had caused suffering himself in the dark early years before he learned control. But children always affected him differently, perhaps because they represented the only truly innocent thing left in a world soaked in blood and betrayal. Slowly, carefully, Victor lowered himself to sit on the cold concrete several feet away, back against the opposite wall, not approaching, not threatening, just present. "What couldn't you watch?" he asked gently. The boy looked up at him, and even in the darkness, Victor could see the war happening in those young features. The desperate need to tell someone, anyone, the learned fear of speaking truth, the exhaustion that comes from carrying secrets too heavy for small shoulders. "My mom," the boy whispered finally. "He hurts her." Victor went very, very still. The kind of stillness that comes before violence. The kind that apex predators adopt in the instant before they strike. But his voice remained soft, controlled. "Who hurts her?" "Her boyfriend. Kyle." The name came out like poison. "He moved in 6 months ago. At first he was nice. Brought pizza. Helped with rent." Mom smiled more. The boy wiped his nose on his sleeve, a gesture so achingly human. It made something twist in Victor's gut. But then he started getting angry. Little things at first. Yelling. Slamming doors. Then he started hitting her. "Have you told anyone? School counselors? Police?" The boy laughed, a broken sound without humor. "The police came once. A neighbor called. Kyle was super nice to them. Said it was all a misunderstanding. Said Mom fell down the stairs." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "She told him the same thing. She was scared, I think. Scared of what he'd do if she told the truth. After they left, The boy's throat worked, unable to finish. "After they left, he hurt her worse," Victor finished quietly. The boy nodded, tears streaming freely now. "Every day there's new bruises. On her arms, her face. Places she tries to hide with makeup and long sleeves. And she pretends everything's fine. Tells me not to worry. Tells me Kyle just has a temper, that he's stressed about work, that she can handle it." His voice rose, edged with desperation. "But I see her flinch every time he moves. I hear her crying at night when she thinks I'm asleep, and I don't know what to do. I'm just a kid. I can't protect her." The last words came out as a wail of anguish, of helplessness, of a child forced to carry adult burdens. The boy buried his face in his hands, shoulders heaving, and Victor felt something he hadn't felt in decades, the hot, sharp edge of righteous fury. Not hunger, not the predatory excitement that came with the hunt. This was different, older, more human, paradoxically. It was a rage of seeing the innocent suffer at the hands of the cruel, the anger of witnessing injustice and having the power to end it. Victor had lived long enough to understand that the world was full of monsters. Some wore fangs and hunted in darkness, but the worst ones looked perfectly human. They held jobs and smiled at neighbors and wore masks of normalcy, while behind closed doors they broke the people who trusted them. Those monsters were the ones Victor truly hated, because they chose cruelty. They weren't driven by hunger or instinct. They hurt because it made them feel powerful, because they could. "What's your name?" Victor asked quietly. The boy looked up, surprised by the question. "Tommy. Tommy Reeves." "Tommy." Victor tasted the name, committed it to memory. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen very carefully." He leaned forward slightly, and his eyes caught the light in a way that made them seem to glow from within. "You are not powerless. You came out here tonight, into the dark, alone and frightened, because you couldn't bear to watch someone you love suffer. That takes more courage than most adults possess. You are not just a kid. You are someone who cares deeply enough to break. And that matters. Tommy stared at him, something like hope flickering in his expression. But what can I do? I can't fight him. He's big and mean, and Mom won't leave him. She says we need him, that she can't afford rent on her own, that it'll get better. It won't get better, Victor said flatly. Men like Kyle don't change. They escalate. The violence always gets worse. Always. He held Tommy's gaze, letting the weight of centuries of observation settle into those words. Your mother is trapped in a cycle of fear and false hope. She's been manipulated into believing she deserves this, or that she has no other options, or that you're better off with a roof over your head, even if that roof shelters a monster. So what do I do? Tommy's voice was small, lost. Victor was silent for a long moment, thinking, calculating, weighing centuries of carefully maintained neutrality against the image of a child's tear-stained face, against the knowledge that somewhere in this city, a woman was probably nursing fresh bruises, telling herself lies to make it through another night. Finally, he spoke. You've done the hardest part already. You've told someone. You've broken the silence. Now! He paused, something dark and decisive settling into his features. Now you let me handle it. Tommy blinked. What do you mean? Victor stood in one fluid motion, a movement too graceful to be entirely human. He looked down at the boy, and in the dim light, his face seemed different somehow. Older, harder, etched with purpose. Give me your address. Why? Because I'm going to pay Kyle a visit. Fear flashed across Tommy's face. No, you can't. He'll hurt you. He's dangerous. Victor smiled then, but it was not a kind expression. It was a smile of something that had stalked prey through countless centuries, something that understood violence on a level humans couldn't comprehend. Tommy, he said softly, I promise you, Kyle is not the dangerous one in this equation. I am. There was something in his voice, in his eyes, in the sudden cold that seemed to radiate from him, that made Tommy believe. The boy rattled off an address, an apartment complex on the east side, the kind of place where nobody asked questions and everybody minded their own business. Go home, Victor said. Act normal. Go to your room. Whatever happens, stay in your room. Don't come out, no matter what you hear. Understand? Tommy nodded slowly, standing on shaky legs. Are you going to kill him? It was a child's question, asked with a child's directness. No euphemism. No dancing around the truth. Victor looked at him for a long moment. I'm going to make sure he never hurts your mother again. That's all you need to know. Who are you? Tommy whispered. Why would you help us? You don't even know us. Victor turned away, coat swirling around his legs, already moving toward the mouth of the alley. His voice drifted back, barely audible over the wind. Let's just say, I have a particular hatred for bullies, especially the kind who hurt women and children. And I've lived long enough to stop pretending I can't do something about it. Then he was gone, melting into shadow and fog like he'd never been there at all, leaving Tommy standing alone in the alley, heart pounding, wondering if he'd just imagined the whole encounter, wondering what exactly was about to happen, wondering who, or what, that strange man with the sad, ancient eyes really was. The wind picked up, carried with it the distant sound of sirens and the promise of storm. Somewhere in the city, Kyle was probably drunk, probably angry, probably looking for an excuse to make someone else feel his pain. He had no idea that tonight, finally, someone was going to make him feel theirs. The boy ran home through streets that suddenly seemed less dark, less dangerous. Because somewhere out there, moving through the night with purpose older than the city itself, was someone who had listened, someone who had believed him, someone who was going to do something. Tommy didn't know if he should feel relieved or terrified. In the end, he felt both. The riverside apartment slouched against the October sky, like a drunk leaning on a lamppost, for stories of peeling paint, rusted fire escapes, and windows that reflected nothing but the accumulated resignation of their inhabitants. This was the kind of building where dreams came to die quietly, where people learned to ignore sounds from neighboring units, where the superintendent answered no questions and fixed nothing unless absolutely forced. Victor stood across the street, concealed in the deep shadow between two buildings, and simply observed. Apartment 3C, third floor, corner unit. Lights on. Through the thin curtains he could see movement. A woman's silhouette, quick and nervous, moving from room to room. Then a larger shadow, male, sudden and aggressive. The woman's silhouette flinched, pulled back. Even from here, even without superhuman senses, the body language told a clear story. Victor's hands clenched into fists inside his coat pockets. The hunger stirred, responding to his rage. But he pushed it down. This wasn't about feeding. This was about something else entirely. Something he'd spent centuries trying to avoid because it meant acknowledging he still cared about humans despite everything that had been done to him, despite the monster he'd become. But children's tears had a way of breaking through even the most carefully constructed emotional armor. He waited. Patience was one thing immortality taught thoroughly. He waited as the lights in the apartment flickered. Television, probably. Waited as Tommy's small silhouette appeared briefly in what must be his bedroom window before the curtains closed. The boy had made it home. Good. Now Victor just needed him to stay there. Stay safe. Stay in his room like he'd been told. Around 11:30, the pattern changed. The large shadow grabbed something, coat probably, and moved toward the door. Victor's enhanced hearing picked up Ray's voices, the woman's pleading tone, then a sharp crack that could only be flesh meeting flesh, followed by a muffled cry. The apartment door slammed open. Kyle emerged, early 30s, barrel-chested, wearing a stained shirt and jeans, face flushed with alcohol and anger. He stomped down the external staircase, each footfall a small act of violence against metal and concrete. Victor moved. He intercepted Kyle at the bottom of the stairs, stepping out of shadows so smoothly it seemed as though the darkness had simply solidified into human form. Kyle nearly walked into him, pulled up short, took an aggressive step back. "The hell?" Kyle slurred, breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "Watch where you're going, asshole." Up close, Victor could see the details that painted a complete picture. Knuckles scabbed and scarred from repeated impact. A neck tattoo of a skull with hardcore written beneath it in aggressive font. Eyes that held the particular emptiness of someone who'd learned to enjoy causing pain. And on his right hand, wrapped around a car key, a gold ring that had left its impression on a woman's cheek more than once. "Kyle Brennan," Victor said quietly. Not a question. Kyle's eyes narrowed with the paranoid hostility of the habitually violent. "Who's asking?" "Someone who knows what you are." "Yeah." Kyle took a step forward, using his size as intimidation, a tactic that had probably worked countless times before. He had maybe 30 pounds and 3 inches on Victor. And what am I exactly? A coward who beats women and terrorizes children. Victor's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, devoid of emotion, which somehow made it more terrifying than any amount of anger could have. A small, weak man who needs to hurt people who can't fight back just to feel like he's worth something. Kyle's face went from red to purple. "You don't know shit about me. I know Sarah Reeves has a bruise on her left cheek. Another on her collarbone, probably more hidden beneath her clothes. I know her son Tommy ran away tonight because he couldn't stand watching his mother suffer. I know the police have been called before, and you lied your way out of consequences. I know." Victor's voice dropped even lower, became something colder than winter frost. "That tonight, that pattern ends." For a moment, Kyle seemed genuinely confused. Then his expression shifted through several emotions. Surprise that someone new, rage at being confronted, and finally a kind of sneering contempt that suggested he'd talked his way out of worse situations before. "Listen, man, I don't know what that little shit told you, but..." Victor moved. One moment he was standing 3 feet away. The next, his hand was locked around Kyle's throat, lifting him completely off the ground, slamming him back against the brick wall hard enough to crack mortar. The car key clattered to the pavement. Kyle's eyes went wide. He clawed at Victor's hand, kicked uselessly, made choking sound that echoed in the empty street. But Victor's grip was absolute, immovable, the strength of something that was no longer entirely bound by human limitations. "I'm going to explain something to you." Victor said, his voice perfectly calm despite the violence of his actions. And I need you to listen very carefully, because your life depends on understanding what I tell you. He released pressure slightly, not enough to let Kyle breathe comfortably, but enough that he wouldn't pass out. Kyle gasped, whimpered, and Victor felt a dark satisfaction at seeing fear in those eyes. The same fear Sarah probably felt every single day. The same fear that had driven Tommy into the night. You think you're dangerous, Victor continued. You think because you're bigger than a woman, stronger than a child, because you can make them afraid, that makes you powerful. But you have no idea what real power is. You have no concept of what real monsters look like. Victor's eyes caught the streetlight, and for a moment they reflected it wrong. Not like human eyes, but like an animal's, silver and luminous and utterly inhuman. Kyle made a sound like a wounded animal. Tried to look away, but Victor's free hand caught his chin. Forced eye contact. I've walked this earth for 300 years, Victor said softly. I've seen empires rise and fall. I've watched humans invent new ways to hurt each other generation after generation. I've fed on murderers and thieves and all manner of evil men. And do you know what I've learned, Kyle? The truly dangerous ones, the real predators. We don't hurt those weaker than us. That's the mark of something pathetic. Something that deserves no mercy. What are you? Kyle managed to choke out. Victor smiled, and it was not a human expression. His lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth that were just a fraction too sharp, too white, too predatory. I'm the thing that comes when prayers go unanswered, when justice fails, when children cry in alleys because the system meant to protect them has abandoned them. He leaned closer, until his face was inches from Kyle's, until the man could feel the unnatural cold radiating from him, could see his own terrified reflection in those inhuman eyes. Here's what's going to happen, Victor said. You're going to leave. Tonight, you're going to pack whatever matters to you into that pathetic car of yours, and you're going to drive away from this city. You will never contact Sarah again. You will never come near Tommy again. You will disappear from their lives as completely as if you never existed. And if I don't... Kyle tried for defiance, but achieved only trembling fear. Victor's smile widened. Then I'll find you, and what I do to you will make every moment of suffering you've ever inflicted seem like a mercy by comparison. I'll break every bone in your body, slowly, carefully, giving each one time to heal before breaking it again. I'll make you feel every ounce of fear, every moment of pain that you've given to that woman and her son. And when you finally beg me to end it, when death seems like salvation... He paused, let the weight of centuries settle into his voice. I'll keep you alive, because I can, because I've learned how, because unlike you, when I choose violence, I do it with purpose and skill and an understanding of suffering that you couldn't imagine in your worst nightmares. Kyle was crying now, actual tears streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat of pure terror. His pants were wet. He'd lost control of his bladder, reduced to something less than human by the realization that he was no longer the predator in this scenario. Please, he whispered. Please don't hurt me. I'll go. I'll leave. I swear. Just let me go. Victor held him there a moment longer, letting the fear sink in deep, letting it carve itself into Kyle's nervous system at a primal level, so that even if he wanted to come back, even if rage or pride tried to override his survival instinct, the terror would remain, a brand, a lesson written in neurochemistry. Then he released him. Kyle collapsed to the pavement, gasping, sobbing, looking up at Victor like a damned soul staring at a demon. Victor towered over him, coat billowing slightly in the wind, face cast in shadow except for those terrible, glowing eyes. You have until sunrise, Victor said. After that, I come looking. And trust me, you don't want that. He turned and walked away, melting back into shadow, leaving Kyle huddled on the ground, broken not in body but in spirit. Victor could hear the man's racing heartbeat, smell the acrid scent of fierce sweat and urine, feel the waves of terror rolling off him. Good. Some people needed to be afraid. Some people only understood fear because they'd built their entire existence on inflicting it. To reach them, to actually change their behavior, you had to speak their language. And Kyle's language was violence and intimidation. Victor had simply shown him a more fluent speaker. He moved through the night toward a vantage point where he could observe the apartment building. Within minutes, Kyle scrambled to his feet, fumbled for his keys, ran up the stairs with the desperate urgency of prey fleeing a predator. Through the walls, Victor's enhanced hearing tracked his progress. Door slamming open, Sarah's startled cry, Kyle's frantic voice. "I have to go. I'm leaving. Don't follow me." Sounds of drawers being yanked open, belongings thrown into bags. Sarah's voice, confused, frightened. "Kyle, what happened?" "What's wrong?" "Just stay away from me. Stay the fuck away." More crashing sounds. Then Kyle was back in the hallway, bags in hand, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He threw everything in his car, a beat-up sedan that looked like it might not make out of state, and peeled out of the parking lot with the desperation of someone pursued by demons, which, Victor supposed, he was. The vampire stayed in the shadows, watching until the taillights disappeared into the distance. Then he turned his attention back to apartment 3C. The lights were still on. Through his supernatural senses, he could hear Sarah moving through the space, confused, probably finding evidence of Kyle's hasty departure. He could hear her crying, not sound of pain this time, but something more complex. Relief mixed with confusion, mixed with a particular grief that comes from the end of something that hurt you, but that you convinced yourself was love. And he could hear Tommy's door crack open, hear the boy's whispered question. "Mom? Is he really gone?" I think so, baby. I don't know what happened, but yes, he's gone." There was a long pause. Then, "Good. I'm glad he's gone." Sarah made a sound that could have been a laugh or a sob. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Victor listened to them embrace, heard Sarah promise it would be better now, heard Tommy's young voice say he loved her, heard the ordinary sounds of a small family beginning to heal. And something in his chest, that cold, dead space where his heart used to beat, ached with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't satisfaction, though there was some of that. It wasn't pride, though perhaps a little of that too. It was something older, more fundamental. It was a feeling of having made a choice that mattered, of having used his power for something other than mere survival or hollow pleasure, of having been, for one night at least, exactly what he claimed to be, the thing that comes when prayers go unanswered. He turned away from the building, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. The night was still young by his standards. The city still breathed with 1,000 small dramas, 1,000 moments of joy and sorrow and everything between. But he'd played his part in one of them tonight, had tilted the scales just slightly toward justice in a world that so often seemed devoid of it. As he walked, Victor found himself thinking about the encounter in the alley, about Tommy's tears, about the way the boy had looked at him with desperate hope, believing against all odds that this stranger might actually help. Children had such capacity for faith. Even when the world had shown them its cruelty, they could still believe in rescue, still believe in heroes. Victor knew he was no hero. Heroes didn't feed on human blood. Heroes didn't have to actively fight the urge to drain every heartbeat from the people they encountered. Heroes didn't carry the weight of 3 centuries' worth of deaths on their conscience. But maybe, just maybe, monsters could do good things too. Maybe the line between hero and villain wasn't as clear as the stories claimed. Maybe it was possible to be both damned and purposeful. Maybe redemption wasn't about becoming something you weren't, but about choosing carefully what you did with what you were. The fog rolled in thicker now, coating the streets in gray mist that swallowed sound in distorted distance. Victor walked through it like a ghost, invisible and ancient and alone. Always alone. But tonight, that loneliness felt different somehow. Less like a punishment and more like a choice. He was alone because he'd lived too long, seen too much, lost too many people. But he could still act, still intervene, still make the kind of difference that immortality and power afforded him. Behind him, somewhere in that dilapidated building, a woman and her son slept without fear for the first time in months. They didn't know who had helped them, didn't understand what had happened, would probably never learn the truth. That was fine. Victor didn't need their gratitude or understanding. The act itself was enough. The knowledge that he'd taken his monstrous nature and bent it towards something resembling justice. That was payment enough for the risk, for the energy expended, for breaking his long-standing rule about non-interference. The night welcomed him back into its embrace, and Victor Ashford, the Vampire King, disappeared into darkness once more, carrying with him the ghost of a child's tears and the echo of a promise kept. 3 weeks passed. Victor had returned to his usual patterns, hunting carefully, feeding only when necessary, avoiding human entanglement with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned that lesson in blood and tears many times over. He told himself the incident with Kyle and the Reeves family was an isolated occurrence, an anomaly, a momentary lapse in judgment driven by the peculiar vulnerability of seeing a child suffer. It wouldn't happen again. It couldn't happen again, because intervention created connections, and connections created vulnerabilities. And for someone that lived as long as he did, vulnerabilities were fatal. You couldn't afford to care. Caring meant pain. Meant watching everyone you loved age and die while you remained unchanged, eternally separate, eternally alone. Better to stay detached. Better to remain the observer, the witness, the monster in the shadows who touched human lives as minimally as possible. That was the theory, anyway. The practice proved more complicated. Victor found himself walking past the Riverside apartments more often than he should. Just checking, he told himself. Just making sure Kyle hadn't returned, hadn't broken his promise out of spite or stupidity or drunken courage. Just ensuring that the fear Victor had instilled had stuck. But if he was honest, and 3 centuries had taught him the importance of honesty with oneself, he was checking on them, on Sarah, on Tommy, making sure they were okay. The apartment showed changes, small ones, but visible to someone who looked. New curtains in the windows, flowers in a window box that hadn't been there before. The door had been repainted. No longer the scuffed, dented surface that spoke of violence, but fresh blue that suggested new beginnings. And through his supernatural hearing, when he dared get close enough, Victor could catch fragments of their lives. Sarah's voice lighter now, without that constant undercurrent of fear. Tommy's laugh, genuine and young. The sounds of a normal home. Dishes clattering, television playing, the comfortable silences of people who felt safe together. It should have satisfied him. Should have been enough to confirm his intervention had worked, that he could move on, consider the matter closed. Instead, it made that ache in his chest worse. On the 19th night after his confrontation with Kyle, Victor stood in his usual observation spot across from the apartments and acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. He'd become attached, not just to the outcome of his actions, but to these specific humans, to their continued well-being, to the knowledge that somewhere in this cold, cruel city, there was a small pocket of healing that he'd helped create. This was dangerous. This was exactly the kind of emotional investment that led to disaster. He should leave, should find a different hunting ground, a different city, should put distance between himself and the Reeves family before. I knew you'd come back. Victor spun, faster than human eye could track, hand already moving to his coat pocket where he kept a knife, silver-edged, useful against the rare supernatural threats that occasionally crossed his path. But he stopped when he saw who had spoken. Tommy stood 10 feet away, bundled in a better coat than the threadbare thing he'd worn in the alley, looking simultaneously nervous and determined. In the streetlight, his face showed changes too, more color in his cheeks, less shadow under his eyes. He looked like a child who was sleeping properly for the first time in months. "Tommy," Victor said slowly, lowering his hand. "It's late. You shouldn't be out here." "I've been watching for you," the boy said simply. "Every night. Mom thinks I'm doing homework in my room, but I've been watching the street. I knew you'd come back. I knew you'd check on us." Victor didn't bother denying it. The boy was clearly more observant than he'd given him credit for. "You should go home." "Not until I say thank you." "There's nothing to thank me for." "You're kidding, right?" Tommy stepped closer, and Victor found himself taking an instinctive step back. The boy didn't seem to notice. "He's gone. Kyle's gone. Mom says he just left one night. Said he was moving out of state for a job or something. But I know that's not what happened. I know you did something. Tommy, she's different now." The boy continued, words tumbling out a rush as if he'd been holding them back for weeks. "She smiles all the time. She got a second job, a better one at a bakery downtown. She sings when she makes dinner. She doesn't flinch anymore when someone moves too fast. She's like she used to be before Kyle, before everything got bad. Victor felt something twist inside him. Pride, satisfaction, and underneath it, the dangerous warmth of being needed, of matching to someone. All the things he'd learned to avoid. I'm glad she's healing, he said carefully. But you need to forget about me, Tommy. Forget you ever met me. Go home. Live your life. That's all I wanted, for you and your mother to be safe and happy. But who are you? Tommy asked. Really? I've been thinking about that night, about the things you said, the way you moved, your eyes. He trailed off, and Victor could see the wheels turn behind that young, sharp mind. You're not normal. You're something else. Something you don't want to know more about, Victor finished firmly. Trust me on this, Tommy. Some questions are better left unasked. Some answers are more frightening than any mystery. I'm not scared of you. You should be. But you helped us. You saved Mom. Why would I be scared of someone who saved us? Because I could kill you as easily as breathing, Victor thought, but didn't say. Because the only thing standing between you and being my prey is my own self-control, which is not nearly as reliable as you'd want it to be. Because I'm a monster who sometimes does good things, but that doesn't make me safe. That doesn't make me less monstrous. Instead, he said, because good deeds don't change fundamental nature. I helped you because I wanted to, because seeing your mother hurt made me angry. But that doesn't mean I'm a good person, Tommy. It just means I was useful to you in that moment. Are you like a superhero or something? Tommy's voice held cautious hope mixed with the kind of wonder only children possessed. Like in comics? Someone with powers who goes around helping people? Victor almost laughed at that. Almost. No, I'm not a hero. Heroes don't have to fight every instinct they possess just to maintain a conversation with a child without wanting to. He cut himself off, jaw clenching. He'd already said too much. But Tommy wasn't stupid. Victor saw understanding dawn in those young eyes. Saw the boy process the implications. Fit together the pieces of a puzzle he'd been working on for 3 weeks. You're a vampire, Tommy whispered. The word hung in the air between them. Absurd and impossible and absolutely true. Victor should have denied it. Should have laughed it off as childish fantasy. Should have done anything except what he did, which was nothing. His silence was confirmation enough. Tommy's eyes went wide. Not with fear. That would have been easy to handle. No. The boy looked fascinated. Amazed. Like he'd just discovered proof of magic in a world that had taught him to expect only pain and disappointment. That's impossible, Tommy said, but his voice suggested he absolutely believed it. Vampires aren't real. They're just stories. Most stories come from somewhere, Victor replied quietly. Though I can assure you, reality is far less romantic than fiction suggests. No capes, no castles, just existence, hunger, and a very long time to regret your mistakes. How long? 300 years, give or take. Tommy's mouth fell open. 300? But that means you were born in the 1700s. You've seen everything. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I and II, the moon landing, the internet, everything. Everything, Victor agreed, and there was a weight in that word that spoke of countless memories, countless losses. It's not as wonderful as it sounds. Watching history unfold just means watching humanity make the same mistakes over and over, dressed in different costumes. Then why did you help us? If you're so cynical about humans, if you've seen it all before, why did you bother? It was a good question. Victor had been asking himself the same thing for 3 weeks. Because, he said finally, choosing his words with care, cynicism and compassion aren't mutually exclusive. I've lived long enough to know that humans are capable of tremendous cruelty, but also tremendous kindness, tremendous courage, and sometimes children cry in alleys, and despite 3 centuries of reasons not to care, you find that you do anyway. Despite everything telling you to walk away, you can't. Because underneath all the years, all the death, all the darkness, somewhere in here, he pressed a hand to his chest, there's still an echo of who I used to be. A young man who believed in justice, who thought the world could be fair, who wanted to protect people. And you still do, Tommy said softly. Protect people, I mean, that's why you came back. That's why you've been watching us. To make sure we're okay. I came back to make sure Kyle stayed gone. No, Tommy shook his head. You came back because you care. Because despite being the scary, powerful thing that probably could do whatever it wants, you choose to use that power to help. That's... He searched for the right word. That's heroic. It's not, Victor said flatly. Don't romanticize this, Tommy. I'm not a character in a story. I've done terrible things. Fed on people. Killed when I had to. I've left behind a trail of bodies and broken lives that would horrify you if you knew the details. Helping you and your mother doesn't erase that, doesn't redeem it. It's just a small counterweight on scales that will never balance. But you're trying, Tommy insisted. That's what matters. You're trying to be better. To do good things even though you don't have to. Even though it would probably be easier to just not care. Victor stared at the boy for a long moment, caught off guard by the simple wisdom in those words. When had he stopped giving himself credit for trying? When had he decided that because he couldn't be perfect, couldn't be human, the effort itself didn't matter? You're very young to be so wise, he said finally. You grow up fast when bad things happen. Tommy replied with a shrug that tried for nonchalance but betrayed the pain underneath. I learned a lot these past few months. About what people are capable of. About how the world doesn't always work the way it should. He met Victor's eyes. But I also learned that sometimes, when you need it most, something impossible shows up and saves you. And maybe that matters more than whether it's a hero or a monster who does the saving. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally arriving. Victor could smell rain on the wind, feel the electricity in the air, sense the way the barometric pressure shifted and changed. His supernatural senses painted a vivid picture of the weather system rolling in from the ocean, dark and heavy with water and lightning. You need to go home, he said again, more urgently this time, before the rain starts. Your mother will worry. Will I see you again? No. The word came out harder than Victor intended. This can't continue, Tommy. You can't know what I am. It's not safe. Not for you and not for me. There are rules, old ones, about exposing our kind to humans. Rules with consequences. What kind of consequences? The kind that end with everyone involved dead, Victor said bluntly. There are others like me. Not many, but enough. And they don't share my restraint. If they learned that a child knew about vampires, that I'd reveal myself to you, they would come, and they would eliminate the problem. Permanently. Tommy paled. You mean they'd kill me? And Mom? Yes. Without hesitation. Without mercy. So you need to forget this conversation. Forget you ever saw me. Live your life, Tommy. That's what I fought for. That's what matters. Not my existence. Not the knowledge of what lurks in the dark, but your chance at a normal, safe, happy childhood. But, please. Victor let the word hang there, raw and honest. I'm asking you to let this go. To let me go. I can't be part of your life. I can't be your friend or your protector or anything else. The best thing I can do for you is disappear. Completely. So that's what I'm going to do. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold, splashing against the pavement and raising the scent of dust and ozone. Tommy looked up at the sky, then back at Victor, conflict warring in his expression. I won't tell anyone, he said finally. I promise. I won't even tell Mom. But if we ever need help again, if something bad happens, it won't, Victor said firmly. You're free now. Kyle's gone. Your mother is healing. You have a chance at a real life. Don't waste it looking for monsters in the shadows. We're only interesting in stories. In reality, we're just sad, lonely things that exist on the edges of a world that's moved on without us. He turned to leave, coat already soaking in the rain that fell harder by the second. But Tommy's voice stopped him one last time. Thank you. For everything. I know you don't think you're a hero, but you're mine. You always will be. Victor didn't turn around. Didn't trust himself to respond without showing the emotion that threatened to crack through his carefully maintained composure. Instead, he simply raised one hand in acknowledgement, and then he was moving, running at inhuman speed, becoming nothing but a blur of shadow and rain, putting distance between himself and the boy who saw him as something he could never be. By the time Tommy blinked, the vampire was gone, vanished into the storm like he'd never been there at all. The boy stood alone in the rain for a moment longer, then turned and ran home, back to the warm apartment, back to his mother, who was probably already worried about where he'd gone. And in the darkness, moving between buildings with the fluid grace of something that had never truly belonged to the world of light and life, Victor tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing. That cutting ties was merciful. That distance was safety. But the ache in his chest suggested otherwise. Suggested that maybe, just maybe, he'd found something he didn't even know he'd been looking for. Someone who knew what he was and didn't flinch. Who looked at a monster and saw potential for good. Who believed in redemption, even when Victor himself had given up on it centuries ago. He pushed the thought away. He couldn't afford to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to attachment. And attachment led to loss. And loss was the one pain that 300 years hadn't numbed even slightly. Better to be alone. Better to be forgotten. Better to return to the comfortable cold of isolation than risk the warmth that always ended in ashes. Victor disappeared into the storm, leaving behind a child who will remember him forever, and carrying with him the weight of goodbye that felt far more final than he'd intended. The rain washed away his footprints as if he'd never been there at all. Winter came to Providence like a thief. Quiet, gradual, stealing autumn's warmth 1 degree at a time until the world existed in shades of gray and white and cold. Victor watched it happen from his various vantage points throughout the city, marking the passage of time in ways humans couldn't. He noted when the leaves finished falling, when the first frost etched patterns on windows, when people's breath became visible in the morning air. 2 months had passed since his conversation with Tommy. 2 months of maintaining distance. 2 months of fighting the urge to check on them, to ensure they remained safe. 2 months of succeeding, mostly. He'd only passed by the Riverside apartments 7 times, which was restraint, which was progress, which was the closest thing to moving on that Victor could manage. He'd found new hunting grounds on the other side of the city, far from Tommy and Sarah, fed more carefully, more selectively, taking just enough to sustain himself without causing lasting harm to his prey. He'd even started considering leaving Providence entirely, finding a new city, starting the cycle over again as he'd done countless times before. That's what immortals did. They moved on. They didn't form attachments. They didn't let themselves care. Then, on a December night sharp with cold and crystalline with snow, everything changed. Victor was crossing through what used to be the old wharf district, mostly abandoned warehouses now, the fishing industry having moved elsewhere decades ago, when he felt it, a presence, old, powerful, malevolent, another vampire. His senses went on high alert immediately. In 3 centuries, he'd encountered perhaps 50 others of his kind. Most of those encounters had been brief, territorial posturing that ended with both parties moving on to avoid conflict. A few had been violent, ending with one of them destroyed. But all of them had been tense because vampires were solitary by nature, predatory, and 2 predators in the same hunting ground was a recipe for disaster. This presence felt wrong. Not just powerful, but twisted. Hungry in a way that suggested no control, no restraint, no humanity left at all. Victor moved toward it cautiously, every instinct screaming danger, but unable to ignore the threat. This was a city. He'd claimed it decades ago, and while he didn't actively police it, he also couldn't let another vampire run wild here. Not when running wild usually meant bodies piling up, drawing attention, bringing hunters. He found her in a collapsed warehouse, standing over a man's body or what was left of it. The corpse had been savage, throat torn out, blood pooled beneath in quantities that suggested she'd fed messily, violently, wasting more than she consumed. She looked up as Victor entered, and he got his first clear look at her. Young, at least in appearance, maybe 17 when she'd been turned. dark hair matted with blood, eyes that burned with crimson hunger. Her clothes were filthy, torn, suggesting she'd been living rough for some time. And her face held the expression of something that had long since stopped being human in any meaningful sense. "This is my territory," Victor said quietly, keeping his voice low despite the rage building in him. Not at her presence, but at the waste, the unnecessary brutality. "You need to leave." She smiled, revealing teeth too sharp, too blood-stained. "Or what? You'll make me? If necessary." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I've been watching you, Vampire King," she said his title with mocking emphasis. "You walk these streets pretending to be civilized, pretending you're better than what you are, taking sips when you could drain them dry, showing mercy to prey. It's pathetic. It's called control. It's called weakness." She circled him slowly, and Victor tracked her movement with the ease of centuries of experience. She was young, probably only a few decades old at most. Powerful, yes, but untrained. Feral. We're apex predators. We're supposed to hunt, to kill, to revel in what we are. But you... She spat blood onto the concrete. "You've neutered yourself, made yourself into a pet, a monster playing at humanity. Is there a point to this conversation? The point is that your territory just became mine. Your rules just became obsolete. And your little pet humans?" She smiled wider. "They're about to learn what a real vampire looks like." Victor went very, very still. "What humans?" "The woman and her boy. In that sad little apartment on the east side. I've been watching them too. Watching you watch them. It's sweet, really. The ancient vampire playing guardian angel to mortals who don't even know he exists." She tilted her head. "Or does the boy know? I saw you talking to him. Saw him looking at you like you were special. That's against our laws, isn't it? Revealing yourself to humans? I wonder what the council would say if they knew the great Victor Ashford had broken the first law." Ice flooded Victor's veins. Not the normal cold of his undead state, but genuine fear. "Touch them and I'll destroy you." "Will you?" She spread her arms wide. "Because I don't think you have it in you anymore. I think you've gone soft. I think decades of playing nice have dulled your edge. I think..." She didn't get to finish her thought. Victor moved with speed he rarely unleashed, crossing the distance between in a blink, hand closing around her throat. But she was fast too, inhumanly so, and she twisted out of his grip with a snarl, claws raking across his face hard enough to draw black blood. They fought, not the careful, controlled violence of humans, but the savage, brutal combat of apex predators. They moved too fast for human eyes to track, smashing through rotted wood and rusted metal, tearing chunks out of each other that healed almost as quickly as they formed. The warehouse echoed with the sounds of their battle, snarls and hisses, and the crunch of bone and flesh. She was younger but wild, uncontrolled. Victor was older, more skilled, but he'd been holding back his true nature for so long that unleashing it felt foreign, difficult, like using muscles that had atrophied. The fight raged for minutes that felt like hours. Victor gained the upper hand twice, only to have her slip free. She drew blood more times than he could count, her claws and teeth finding purchase while he tried to subdue rather than kill. That was his mistake. She had no such restraint. She caught him off guard with a feint, ducked under his guard, and her teeth found his throat. Not to feed, to tear, to rip out the major vessels that even a vampire needed somewhat intact to function. Victor felt his blood pour out, felt his strength drain with it, felt the world start to dim at the edges. In that moment, 300 years of existence flashed before him. All the deaths, all the loneliness, all the moments of beauty and horror, and everything between. And somehow, impossibly, what rose to the top wasn't the grand moments or historic events. It was Tommy's tears in the alley, his mother's relieved sobs, the boy's voice saying, "You're my hero." Victor had lived for 3 centuries, but he hadn't truly lived for a purpose in any of them until the night he chose to help a child, until he decided that maybe being a monster didn't mean he had to be monstrous, until he found something worth protecting beyond his own existence. He would not die here, would not let this feral thing destroy, what little good he'd managed to create. With the last of his strength, Victor stopped fighting like a civilized creature and fought like what he truly was, a 300-year-old apex predator with nothing left to lose. He caught her jaw as she pulled back from his throat. His grip tightened with all the accumulated power of centuries. And he twisted. The sound of her neck breaking was like a gunshot in the empty warehouse. She fell, body twitching, trying to heal but unable to regenerate fast enough. Victor collapsed beside her, hand pressed to his own throat, feeling his blood, his life, still pouring out between his fingers. He needed to feed, needed blood to heal, and there was a corpse right here, still fresh enough that his prey's blood would work even if it wasn't ideal. Victor crawled to the dead man, pressed his mouth to the torn throat, and drank. It tasted like copper and death and desperation. It filled him with warmth, with strength, with the borrowed life force that would allow his supernatural healing to kick in properly. He drank until the corpse was empty, until his throat had closed, until he could breathe again without blood bubbling up. Then he turned his attention to the female vampire. She was healing too, but slowly. She'd be vulnerable for maybe another minute before she regenerated enough to fight again. Victor had a choice. He could finish her, could tear out her heart or separate her head from her body, or do any of the things that would end a vampire permanently. Or he could show mercy. He thought about Tommy, about the boy who'd looked at a monster and seen potential for good, about the question Tommy hadn't asked but that had hung in the air between them. What kind of monster are you? The kind that kills when necessary, Victor decided, but only when necessary. He pulled a length of rusted chain from the debris, wound it around the female vampire's wrists and ankles with supernatural strength, binding her tight enough that even vampire musculature would struggle to break free. Then he pulled out his phone, a concession to modern times he'd adopted reluctantly, and dialed a number he'd hoped never to use. It rang 3 times before a voice answered. Male, old, cultured. Victor, it's been a long time. Marcus, Victor said tiredly. I need the council. There was a pause. The Council of Ancients was the closest thing vampires had to government, a group of the oldest, most powerful vampires who enforced what few laws their kind acknowledged. Victor had avoided them for over a century, preferring independence to politics. What happened? Marcus asked carefully. A feral, young, probably 20, 30 years old at most, killing messily in my territory and threatening to expose our kind. She's bound. I need someone to collect her. Did she break the first law? Victor hesitated. The first law was simple. Don't reveal yourself to humans in ways that could expose all vampires. The penalty for breaking it was death, for the vampire who broke it, and for any humans who knew. No, Victor lied, but she threatened to, and she's out of control. She needs to be contained or destroyed before she draws hunters to Providence. We'll send someone tonight. Keep her secured until then. A pause. Victor, are you all right? You sound weak. I'll heal. Just send someone quickly. I have something else I need to handle. He ended the call before Marcus could ask more questions, pocketed the phone, and looked down at the bound vampire. She was conscious now, eyes burning with hate. You should have killed me, she hissed. Probably, Victor agreed, but I'm trying to be better than my worst impulses. You should try it sometime. They'll destroy you when they learn about your humans. They won't learn, because you're not going to tell them. Because if you do, I'll tell them that you were the one who broke the first law, that you're the one who revealed yourself to mortals. And then it won't be me they destroy, it'll be you. You're bluffing. Am I? Victor leaned closer, let her see the cold resolve in his eyes. I've lived for 3 centuries by being very good at survival, by making calculated choices, by knowing when to show mercy and when to be ruthless. Right now, you're alive because I chose mercy. But if you threaten what I've claimed as mine, if you come near Tommy or Sarah ever again, I will choose differently. Do you understand? Something in his voice, in his expression, must have convinced her. She nodded slowly, hatred still burning but tempered now with caution. Good. Victor stood, swaying slightly from blood loss but staying upright through sheer will. The council will be here soon. I suggest you cooperate with them. Explain that you're young, that you didn't know the rules, that you'll learn. They might let you live if you're properly contrite. Might even find you a territory of your own. He started to walk away, then paused. Or they might destroy you. Either way, you won't be my problem anymore. Victor left her there, bound and bleeding and alive, and stumbled out into the December night. Snow was falling now, soft and clean, covering the city's sins in white. He needed to feed again, properly this time, to finish healing. But first, he needed to check on Tommy and Sarah. Needed to make sure this feral vampire hadn't gotten to them before he'd intervened. The walk to the riverside apartments felt longer than usual. Every step was an effort. His body was healing but slowly, demanding more blood than he'd been able to take. The cold bed him more than it should, suggesting his control was slipping, his supernatural resistance compromised. But he kept moving. He had to know they were safe. When he finally arrived, he positioned himself in his usual spot across the street and looked up at apartment 3C. Lights on, movement inside. Through the window, he could see Sarah moving through the kitchen, preparing dinner. And there was Tommy, sitting at the table, doing homework, looking bored in the way only a child forced to do math problems could look. They were safe, alive, untouched. Victor felt something in his chest unclench. The relief was so profound it was almost painful. He hadn't realized how much fear he'd been carrying until it lifted. He should leave now, should trust that the council would handle the feral, that his territory would be secure again, that Tommy and Sarah could continue their lives without ever knowing how close they had come to disaster. But even as he thought it, he saw Tommy look up from his homework, saw the boy's gaze drift to the window, saw him stand, move closer to the glass, and look out into the snowy night. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Victor should have moved, should have hidden, should have maintained the fiction that he'd stayed away, that he'd kept his promise to disappear from their lives. Instead, he stood there, let himself be seen, let Tommy see the blood on his clothes, the exhaustion in his posture, the evidence that something had happened, something bad. Tommy's eyes went wide. He pressed a hand to the window, and Victor could read the question in his expression. "Are you okay?" Victor nodded slowly, mouthed the words, "I'm fine. You're safe." Tommy hesitated, clearly wanted to come down, to talk, to understand what had happened. But then Sarah called his name, and the boy looked back into the apartment, conflict warring on his features. Victor made the decision for him. He raised one hand in farewell. Not goodbye, not this time, but acknowledgement. Thanks for caring. I'm glad you're safe. Then he turned and walked away, letting the snow swallow him, letting distance grow between them once more. But this time, it felt different. This time, he wasn't running from connection. He was protecting it, keeping it alive by keeping it at a distance, by ensuring that no one, not the council, not other vampires, not the dangerous elements of his world, could ever use Tommy and Sarah against him. This was what love looked like for monsters. Not closeness, but careful distance. Not presence, but watchful absence. Not promises, but silent protection. Victor had spent 3 centuries learning to be alone. But tonight, walking through falling snow with wounds slowly healing and purpose renewed, he realized he wasn't truly alone. Somewhere in this city, 2 humans lived their lives without fear because he'd chosen to act. They didn't know he still watched over them. Didn't understand the threats he'd faced down to keep them safe. And that was fine. Better, even. Real protection didn't need gratitude or acknowledgement. It just needed to be done. He found prey in the early morning hours. A mugger stalking a woman through an alley. Someone whose karma suggested he'd done this many times before. Victor drained him carefully, taking only what was needed, leaving him alive but with a fear of darkness that would probably keep him indoors for the rest of his life. Then, as dawn approached and his wounds finally sealed completely, Victor found his way to the old church on the hill. He'd been here before, many times over the decades. Never inside. That was too much even for him. Too many memories of what he'd once believed before darkness claimed him. But the ground were peaceful. The old cemetery behind it held stone markers weathered by centuries, names faded, people forgotten by everyone except maybe him. He sat on a bench facing east, watching the skies slowly lighten from black to gray to the pale blue of winter dawn. The sun would rise soon. He'd need to find shelter before it did. But for now, he allowed himself this moment. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said quietly to whatever might be listening. "God, universe, the indifferent cosmos. I don't know if prayers from things like me carry any weight. But thank you for letting me help them, for giving me a purpose beyond just existing, for reminding me that maybe 300 years of life can still mean something if I choose to make it mean something." The sky brightened further. Bird began to sing. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, calling the faithful to early mass. Victor stood, pulled his coat tighter, and walked back toward the shadows, back to his refuge, his safe spaces, his carefully constructed life on the edges of humanity. But he carried with him something he hadn't had in longer than he could remember. Hope, not for himself. He was beyond salvation, beyond redemption, beyond the light that humans took for granted, but hope that his existence could still cast a shadow that protected rather than consumed, that the monster he'd become could, in small ways, in careful moments, be a guardian instead of predator. It wasn't much. It wasn't heroic. It certainly wasn't what Tommy thought it was. But it was real. It was his. And it was enough. The vampire king disappeared into the last shadows before dawn, leaving behind only footprints in fresh snow that would melt away with the morning sun, leaving behind a city that would never know how close it had come to tragedy, leaving behind two humans whose guardian watched from darkness, silent and eternal and utterly alone, but no longer lonely, because somewhere in the space between monster and man, between damnation and purpose, Victor Ashford found what all immortals search for and few ever discovered. A reason to keep going that existed outside themselves. Something worth protecting. Something that justified the weight of centuries. In the end, maybe that was all redemption really meant for the damned. Not forgiveness. Not transformation into something they weren't. Just a choice, repeated day after day, night after night, to use their darkness in service of light. To be the shadow that let others walk in sun. The city woke. Life continued. And somewhere in the spaces between, a vampire king stood watch, keeping his covenant with a child who cried in an alley and reminded him what it meant to care. The story ended where it began, in darkness, with purpose, with a quiet understanding that some heroes wear fangs and walk at night. And sometimes, that's exactly the kind of hero the world needs most.